Thank you. Our guest today is Des Dickerson, former guitarist, founding member for Prince and the Revolution. Des sang and played uh, for the several first Prince albums. He also co-wrote songs with Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis for The Time and Vanity Six. His music's appeared in movies National Lampoon's Summer Vacation and Purple Rain. Des has worked as a studio musician for Aretha Franklin and toured with Billy Idol. He's toured the US and Europe extensively and appeared on numerous network television programs, including Saturday Night Live, American Bandstand, Solid Gold, and appeared in 9 music videos broadcast on MTV and VH1. Mr. Dickerson has worked as producer, executive producer on over 80 albums, and these albums have garnered a total of 19 Dove Award nominations, winning 5 and 1 Grammy nomination. He's been interviewed by a number of domestic and European publications, including Rolling Stone, Billboard, and Musician. His professional history also includes 5 years as vice president of A&R with Star Song Communications, a subsidiary of EMI. Uh, Also, we're very fortunate and excited that Des will be teaching a performance skills class at Middle Tennessee State University this fall. Des, and before we get started, I'd like to play a little video that we sent out to students to let them know that Des was coming to campus and also introduce him. And of course, that class filled up in one day. So we'll play that video now.
Life is just a party and parties weren't meant to last. 2000 party over, out of time. So tonight the party like it's 1999. You need a love that's gonna last. Baby, it was too fast.
Okay. Des, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
I understand you made time for us at a celebrity golf tournament today.
Absolutely. It's something that I do every year. One of the benefits of having lasted this long is you get invited to do fun things like this. But this is important and fun as well. So I'm glad I can be with you.
Well, we're excited, and I really just want to start off, Des, with asking you about how you got into music, how old you were, what your influences were, what led to you getting into music and guitar.
Okay. Well, I grew up in the sort of proverbial musical household. My dad primarily, my mom enjoyed music, but my dad was a musician from an early age, started playing. He was a sax player, started playing in a band that traveled around the Southeast when he was 11 years old. And so I grew up with music always constantly around. Even when my dad had quit music to, get married to as a family, he worked like a couple of jobs and had a late like graveyard shift job at the post office. And I remember waking one night to the sound of music coming from the living room. And I kind of creeped down the stairs, and there were like 4 guys in my living room playing saxophone. It was a bunch of guys that my dad worked with at the post office that were all musicians that were now working the gig. So that's kind of how I grew up.
And what kind of music did you grow up with around the house? What were you hearing?
My dad was about jazz and R&B, like R&B as it used to be. Some, sort of pop stuff. I mean, he would fall in love with songs and with records. I remember the band Procol Harum, the English group Procol Harum, years ago, had a hit with a song called Whiter Shade of Pale. My dad heard that song and just like fell in love with it, bought the 45 and then like wore it out. So he would do things like that. He would listen to Miles and Coltrane and all these things, but then he would also like hear an Isley Brothers single or a Procol Harum single. And and fall in love. But for me, it was always about rock and roll. And it baffled him in the beginning because it's not what he listened to, but he appreciated the fact that it was something that spoke to me and something that I was motivated to do. I mean, he recognized it takes one to know one. So he recognized that, I was one of those guys, and he and my mom equipped me to do what I wanted to do. My whole family literally chipped in and bought me my first real guitar. All my relatives, when it arrived, the airport sort of luggage guys had run over it with a cart and broken the neck. So I had to wait a whole other year to get it replaced. But long story short is my family always supported me. Rehearsed in the basement, hit the walls.
How old were you when you got that guitar?
I was at that time 15. I started playing seriously at age 14. Again, my folks paid for lessons. And after about 6 weeks of lessons, my guitar teacher took my mom aside and said, I've really pretty much taught him everything that I know to teach him. You just need to just wind him up and let him go. Just let him do what he does, because he practices like a beast, which I did. I would practice 6-7 hours a day. And that was it. From then on, there was no looking back.
And what was your music experience or career like pre-Prince? Like what kind of bands were you in? What was that like?
Well, I mean, from the beginning, I started and put together rock bands. So my first band was actually, it was like a 5-piece, 2 guitars, bass, drums, keys. And I was the guitar player, lead singer guy. And we actually had to pay to get in, like the first gig we ever did. That's one of my career highlights. He just paid to get in his own show. But from there, then I really, really got into like the power trio thing. So, bands like Cream and Grand Funk Railroad, and even, bands like Zeppelin, who technically were a power trio with a singer. Those were the bands I loved. So I started a series of those kinds of bands, really starting like age 14, 15. By the time I was 15, one of the booking agencies in town got word about me and what we were doing. There's a guy from Minneapolis who played with a guy named Robin Trower, from Procol Harum, oddly enough, who had started this solo thing and had this like Hendrix deal that he was doing and was blowing up all over the world. And so this guy who was Robin's drummer dated a girl from my school. I was in high school, obviously, at the time. So she brought him to this little gig we did in like the basement of a church, a block up the street from where we went to school. And it was, it was the two of them and like 3 other people. But because he saw the band, freaked out over this kid, this 15-year-old kid that played like Hendrix, he told this agent in town about it. I got a call from him. And so by the time I'm, like a sophomore in high school, I'm having to get notes from my parents to get out of school early on Fridays so we can, go play in East Crevice, South Dakota at the teen center or whatever. And that was kind of my high school years. I played football, loved it, thought that was what I was going to do, but I had to make a decision. And one Friday night under the lights, I got speared on a kickoff return. And the thought occurred to me, nobody's going to do this if you're playing guitar. So I quit that day and focused on music from then on.
I've always been curious about Minneapolis. From what I've read, and or let me say, when I first saw Prince's band, and you were in it, it was a diverse group of people, kind of like Sly and the Family Stone. Mm-hmm. And from what I've read, there weren't a lot of racial barriers in Minneapolis, or there wasn't. There was a more multicultural, kind of diverse scene going on. Is that true? Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It was one of the unique things about the town. And it really, in general, I mean, one of the reasons that my folks are from Middle Tennessee. My folks are from Clarksville. And my dad initially left Clarksville to come to Minneapolis to go to art school. His older brother was at the University of Minnesota. And so, once my dad moved up, he literally, and it's one of those classic stories I'm going to make a movie about someday. He courted my mom by mail. They were next door neighbors growing up. My mom hated my dad, thought he was arrogant and loud, and which he was, but that's all right. And so anyway, they ended up moving up there. So I was born there. But part of the vibe of the city in general is that it was just more of just an open city, with respect to sort of racial and cultural things. And the music scene reflected that. I mean, you would see the bands I grew up following locally. You'd have like a black lead singer fronting a rock band. You'd have, you'd have literally every ethnicity possible in bands. There'd be, there's a Hispanic guy in the band and there's an African-American guy in the band. And that's just the way it was. And we didn't see people now like criticize you if you say, well, we didn't see color. Well, we really didn't, I mean, that's a fact is a fact. We just really didn't. It was about the music.
It seems to me like it really showed up in the music you made, whereas you would hear elements of funk and you'd hear elements of hard rock, and there were a lot of things in the mix in what you guys were doing.
Absolutely. And it was purposeful, and but at the same time, it was natural because it was the product of what we each loved and brought to the table. I mean, Prince loved Grand Funk Railroad and he loved Santana, and we had that in common. But then there were other bands that I loved, and I loved Sly, and I loved all those kinds of things. But what I played was, loud, guitar-based, heavy music. So that was something that he was just happy to incorporate, having that element in the band. And as time went on, new things were happening. I'd be bringing different records to rehearsal saying, there's this band Generation X, you got to hear this song. You got to hear this record. And there was this cross-pollination that happened because of it. And like you said, there was funk, but then there was the edge, there was the very high-powered rock thing, there was pop, there was everything that you can imagine because we loved everything and we were going to do what we loved.
One time you visited with my students with a class, and I was trying to explain to people in their early 20s how outrageous you guys looked when you came on the scene. Like to kids nowadays, maybe that's not that outrageous, right? But when you guys came out and you said we didn't look like anybody else.
Sure.
And I'm just curious, how did you guys come to your look? Because it was really original and it was really outrageous. And I guess it was thought out. Maybe it was just natural. But how did you guys come to that style?
It's interesting because, as you mentioned earlier, I spent a number of years, really 9 years, doing the from the ground up kind of, cover band, trying to play original music thing, and learned both the craft of playing, but also the importance of brand and performing. Before we had those brands, we didn't have that terminology back then. And Prince and Andre Simone, our original bass player, they had come up really focused on the excellence on the music side, and the performing thing was in there, but they brought this musical like intensity that I had always been the guy like dragging the rest of the band to try to be that. So there was like this cross-pollination that happened. I came into the band with this. You have to look the part and you have to live it. You got to go to the grocery store, looking like a rock star if that's what you are. And so after our first photo shoot looked kind of like, a windowless van kind of pulled up and snatched people off the street. And then you threw these 6 people in a room. It was disjointed in the beginning, but then, just like we did with the music, we got serious about the look. And, it was a conscious decision that we were going to take it as far as we could, but it wasn't like a calculated thing. There's a difference between being conscious and being calculated. And Prince, to his credit, said he wanted everybody to have a distinct kind of a visual character of their own. And that's, it took some time, but that's what we developed.
It was interesting because there's elements of new wave, there's elements of punk, there's elements of sexuality. There's a lot of things that went into the look of that band. You touched on the evolution of music, or how hard you guys worked on music. And one thing I've been excited telling students about your class at Middle Tennessee State is, I've been telling them, this is a guy that's not, he's just not, he doesn't know just how to teach somebody to, be a performer. This is somebody that crafted an artistry and an artist and helped build a whole thing musically, visually, like you said, branding before branding. And I'm curious about, as a young person, following Prince's career and the albums you made, from Prince to For You to Dirty Mind to Controversy to 1999, there's this clear development of becoming something. And you can kind of tell you guys are finding your way through albums. What was that like? What was that journey? Were you consciously trying to looking for a sound? Was it just doing songs and that's how it worked out? It's just amazing to me how many people you see come out as artists and musicians, but they don't have that kind of that thing. And it seems like you guys were constantly building on something.
Absolutely. Well, part of it is, and one of the things, for a while I had a business that what we did was kind of do this high level artist career consultation track. And it was kind of like, what D1 is for athletes, that thing where if you think that you got the ability to play, Division I, or you make it to the NFL or the MLB or whatever, okay, let's find out what you got. That was kind of where we came from. And the thing that I always told people is, what? Either you have it or you don't. And we're going to find, you may not know what your it is, but if it's there, we're going to find it. And we're going to teach you how to bring that out. My job is to make you more of what you already were. You just didn't know it yet, or you just didn't know how to maximize it yet. So for us as a band, that was, again, that, nobody taught that class back then, but that was something that for me, in almost 10 years of doing it before we came together as a band, that was something that whether, I stumbled on it before or whatever, that was real and it was purposeful, and I was driven about it. The thing was, Prince and Andre, especially and specifically, had that same desire, but they just, at that point in time, up to that point in time, hadn't really had that flag to rally around. So when the three of us got together, it was like, it was like the Manhattan Project. What happened, something came together that just doesn't happen all the time. And really, back then, it just didn't happen all the time. So everything that we did, we pushed each other in everything we did. There was a day when I was over at Prince's house and I said, man, you just need to get this. This was when VHS and beta were just kind of coming out. You need to get live video of all the great performers, Elvis and Jimmy and the Beatles and Sinatra, and we would just challenge one another like that, and he did. And the thing is, like everything he did, he would meet a challenge and then exceed it. He always learned from people, but it was almost like he could draw that all out, like that scene in Indiana Jones where the Nazi guys get the life sucked out of him by whatever that force was. He would just tap into it, and then he would always excel beyond his teachers. So part of how we did what we did was we were convinced that we were supposed to be the best and the biggest band in the world. We believed it thoroughly, and we were going to make sure that other people did too.
That's interesting that you guys knew that from an early age and had that outlook. Sometimes when I see these college, and of course this is the Association for Popular Music Education, so we have a lot of people that teach college pop band ensembles. And sometimes when I see the young college students, I feel like they're getting ready to play on a cruise ship.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that mentality of just even, and maybe it's, you know, being in a scene like you were in Minneapolis, or say Nashville's a music business sound, or LA, like the whole idea of the whole experience,
Mhm.
the look, the performance. But you were saying you guys watched, you suggested to Prince to go out and get VHS tapes of all the best performers,
Mhm.
and that seems like really great advice for young performers to really watch somebody that knows how to work a stage. And
Mhm.
then I would guess, would you guys watch videos back of yourselves then and critique that as well?
Every night. I mean, it started out one night as a suggestion, and it's something that I know for a fact that Prince did. You know, right up to the end, every single. And when you think about it, it's just game film. I mean,
Yeah.
what does every football player, every coach, what do you do after the game? You watch game film. You see what worked and what didn't. You see what needs to be corrected. You see what needs to be expanded. And so that's what we did. And that's it's something that, you know, it should be standard procedure for everybody, but not everybody really understands that greatness is a conviction and an attitude. It's not an accident. It's not something that's bestowed upon you. And one of the things that's missing, I'm going to rant just a little bit. One of the things that's missing in our business that is built into professional sports, for an example, in football, you know, this fall there will be over 1 million kids that'll be playing Pop Warner and high school football. But by the time you get to the college level, it's about 100,000 kids. You know, and that number is probably going down because of the whole, you know, CTE scare. But then when you get to the NFL level, now you're talking about, you know, 1,000 guys. And I'm talking practice squads, I'm talking the whole nine. So as that thing funnels down, by the time you get to the NFL, everybody was great in high school. Everybody was great in college. Everybody was, you know, all this and all that. So you have to find ways to super differentiate in order to be great. Well, in our business, what happened is at the point where, and I remember I was in the record business when this happened, at the point where folks started thinking they could just, you know, get themselves Logic on their computer and copy and paste, and then I'm going to get a directory. I'm going to send out 10 emails to 10 labels to A&R people, and we'll have a deal by next week. And American Idol also got people addled, American addled, because they
Yeah.
thought, oh, well, that's how you do it. You just go on that show and they'll just make you a star. People stopped working at it. You know, when we were starting in the game, it was you just got out there and you would grind just to be great. We didn't even know how to get before I started playing with Prince. I didn't know how to get a record deal. We were just going to be the best we could be and then see how many people we could convince of it. So that's the end of my rant. But greatness is a choice, and it being great and being famous are two completely different things. There are a lot of people who are famous who are not great, but there's some folks that are great who aren't famous. Some of the most amazing bands I've ever seen, you never heard of. They worked at being great. The other stuff, maybe they didn't work out quite as hard, but
I think what you're talking about with American Idol and the computer, all the computer trickery we have today, that sometimes the focus may be more on being famous or being, you know, entertainment than actually musicianship, or being great. And you guys were doing it all without the help of like learning licks on YouTube or stuff
exactly.
like that. Um, Speaking of conviction and, you know, figuring it out on your own, I know that in Prince's band, you guys only opened for Rick James, the Rolling Stone, and Kool and the Gang once. Besides
Right.
that, you were headliners. But I know
Yep.
you had some hard lessons on the Rolling Stones tour, and I'd love for you to tell everybody about that, because I think it speaks a lot to your character And that was a real character builder.
Mm. It was that. It's interesting because that particular, we did 2 shows with the Stones at the LA Coliseum weekend, kind of split shows, a Friday and then a day off, then a Sunday. But it's kind of
Now,
become
let me
almost,
stop.
go
Let
ahead.
me move. Let me just stop and tell everybody this was very early on in your career. Sorry,
Yeah,
Gary.
yeah. Yeah, we at that point, I think the Dirty Mind album had just come out, and that was like the 3rd record, you know, you know, for you, Prince and Dirty Mind represented this on the label side. It was like the what in the world? It was the WTF record. But on the press side and on the kind of, in the industry side, that was the whoa, what is this? So Mick himself got hold of the record and loved it. And he probably still does. He chose all of the acts that opened for the Stones. He handpicked them. So, our management got the call, and we at that point in time, again, we're some young people that we believe that that's where we should be. Now, some people believe that and it's unwarranted. So understand that. I'm not talking about delusion. I'm talking about conviction. So here's the thing about those shows. They've become the stuff of folklore, but the reality is you had this, as you mentioned earlier, this sort of multicultural, very diverse band, kind of like Sly and the Family Stone, on crack. And you have a front man who is a purposely androgynous kind of, there's a little bit of the sort of the scooter punk thing with the long coats from Quadrophenia is where that came from. And then you got like the bikini underwear, which actually there's a funny story about that. I was there. I know where that came from too. And he's wearing these black leg warmers, which is like a flash dance thing. I don't know where that came from. So bottom line is when this guy comes out in front of Rolling Stones fans, statistically, any public appearance, speaking, performing, whatever it is, 5% of the audience is going to instantly decide they don't like you. Well, when it's a Stones audience and it's 120,000 people and 5,000 of those people are like Hell's Angels, well, they're definitely going to decide they want you dead instantly, not just that they don't like you. So we came out that first day, that first show, and after the first song, I can still hear that sound. I will never forget the sound of almost 100,000 people just going crazy. It was amazing, but there was a contingent of folks that just were determined to end our day early. Not anything serious. I mean, back then, that was when they had the Coca-Cola cups that were like, they had like wax coating or something, paper cups. You'd buy your Coke and then you could crumble them up. Well, people were crumbling up the Coke cups and throwing them at us. And now here's the thing we didn't know until we saw the Stones later that day. The Stones audience pelted them with stuff the whole time. It was an act of love to throw things at the band. We didn't know it at the time, but we found out later. So bottom line is Prince got pretty freaked out because, he personally had not done a lot of shows before we're, in front of 120,000 people at the Coliseum. So he left the stage early. And we're mid-song, still playing. I turn around and I look, and there's this red carpet that goes up the stairs at the Coliseum. I'm seeing this figure, this solitary figure, trudge up the stairs, and I'm like, I guess we're done, So I kind of got everybody else's attention, signaled to the rest of the band, and ended the song, and we, scurried off stage as well. Here's what happened: the word got out that we had gotten booed off the stage. That's not what happened. Bill Graham, legendary promoter who promoted those shows, Bill got up immediately after we were finished, and he started getting on some of the people in the audience because Bill was salty like that. And he was even pointing people out. I see you at every show. And he was going at it. Bill got booed. We didn't get booed. Bill got booed. There was a smattering of boos here and there when we were playing. But, 120,000 people, it didn't matter. Bill got booed. A radio station that was broadcasting live from the Coliseum, broadcast that we'd gotten booed off the stage. Then the LA Times picked it up. It was never true. But by the time the word got out and we had a day off in between, the word on the street was that we'd gotten booed off the stage. Now, in the meantime, Prince had left the stage, and before we could even get backstage, he was on his way to the airport. He was saying, forget this. I don't need this. He went back to Minneapolis. So here we are, Saturday. Management's freaking out. Stones are freaking out. Everybody's freaking out because Prince has gone home and he won't come back. Management calls him. He won't talk to him. Mick calls him on the phone for 15 minutes with Mick. He won't come back. Hear a knock at my door. One of the management team comes to me and says, you know what? You're the only one he listens to. Would you call him? I said, okay. I called. We talked for about, 20 minutes, maybe a half hour. And here's the way I broke it down. I said, man, we cannot let it be said that we were run out of town by anybody, anywhere, anytime. We can't let some dirtballs run us out of town. That was it. That was the thing that spoke to that ethos that we all had. So he said, all right, I'm coming back. And he did, got on a plane. He came back. Now, Sunday was worse because word had gotten out that we'd gotten booed off the stage. So, we tweaked the set before we went on, made it as loud and raucous as we could. So it was as rock and roll a set as that band could play. And we just kind of flew through the set. But, bottom line is the rest literally is history.
That's incredible. I want to ask you about singing co-lead on 1999.
Okay.
Prince was kind of known as having an ego, or as a great artist would. But then one of his breakout singles, he shared lead with you and Lisa, and I can't remember the blonde lady. Jill. Yeah. And you guys took turns. How did that come about that parts were put together like that?
Well, I mean, first of all, the outward sort of the consumer facing sort of side of the Prince brand was that, he was difficult and he had a huge ego and he wanted to do everything himself and he was a control freak. And there was truth to all of that. Not balance necessarily, but there was truth to all of it. But here's the greater reality was that there was an inner circle and there was everybody else. And in the inner circle, he was none of those things. In the inner circle, especially if he respected you. Now, there were two groups in the inner circle. There were those that he respected and there were those that he didn't necessarily respect. That was a whole other thing. That's a story for another day. But in the inner circle, if he respected you, you couldn't have had a better friend, a better bandmate, a better boss. Couldn't have had one. So all of that ego stuff and all of that, control freak stuff, he was demanding. There's no doubt about it. He demanded more of certain people than he demanded of others. There was the others he trusted. And the others, he would just say, hey, what do you think about doing it this way? And if you were cool with it, yeah. If you weren't, you could tell him. He and I had many a conversation where I was like, no, in fact, I'm not even doing that. I'm just not doing that. But that's the relationship that we had. So the bottom line is that when he was working on that record, he kind of approached it from the standpoint of, I want to more than I have to this point in time. I want to bring the band in on this record because he did. He initially was signed as the Wonderkind. He was signed as, the new Stevie Wonder. Stevie Wonder meets, Smokey Robinson at Berry Gordy's house. So it was a huge change for him to say what he had always said privately is that he wanted us to be a band. So that song in particular, he called me up and it was like it was always whenever Prince called. The phone would ring, there'd be a slight delay and he'd say, Des, Prince. Okay, I know your voice. I know it's you. Yeah, but it was funny. You do that every time. And he wanted me to come over to the house. I want you to hear some things. So, we were on opposite sides of the Twin Cities. So it was like a 45-minute drive for me. Got to the house, went down. By now he had an upgraded studio in the basement of his house. So we went down, sat down at the console right away, just threw the tape up and played me the tracks for 1999. And at that time, he had sung like a guide vocal all the way through, but he had new ideas, which was always the case with him. And he thought, I want you to sing lead on these lines throughout the song. Here's the other little known thing is there's the voice, the pitched down voice at the beginning of the song. Don't worry, I won't hurt you. Only want you to have some fun. That voice ostensibly comes back in at the end on the vamp out, repeating 1999. At the beginning of the song, it's Prince's voice. On the vamp out, that's actually my voice. That was something that we ended up adding on the fly. And so all the vocal stuff, the background, that was all something that happened in the room that day.
I love the idea of a band. And, something I've always thought is that because of Prince's persona, his songwriting, singing, I've always thought he was an underrated guitar player. And it certainly showed on the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame clip where he was with Tom Petty and those guys honoring George Harrison on My Guitar Gently Weeps. And he kind of surprised all those old rockers when he jumped out there and showed his stuff. But what I think is really cool is that you also are a badass guitar player, and the fact that Prince had you play lead on on Little Red Corvette, and shared, wanted you to be showcased. How was that for you, being that he's like, no man, you're playing lead? Were you a little, I'm sure you were honored, but was it weird? How was he producing you and you playing guitar? And was that just a natural thing for you guys?
It's funny because it was something that we had started doing live actually a few years before. And I remember the night he came up in the dressing room after a show, I think it was in St. Louis, and said, you know what? From now on, I'm going to let you do most of the guitar playing on stage, especially regarding lead playing. He said, I'm going to put the guitar down in front more. And he said, and there were so many things that we would talk about behind the scenes that if he was here right now, he would say, yep, what he's saying is true. But you say it now and people are like, yeah, sure. That's the way it was. But the reality is he just felt that as far as the lead playing side of it went down, I was just holding it down better. And so it was like, well, there's no need, both of us kind of banging our heads together up there. I'm going to be the front man. I'm going to let you do that thing. So it wasn't a surprise to me when he came and wanted to do that, on a record. It just, at that point in time, because I understood that he saw that as like a distinctive kind of part of my role in the band. And that we weren't really competing to be, it wasn't Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page. We weren't competing, not to be corny, but we were completing. I mean, that's really what it was. And as a rhythm player, I had to work to keep up. I mean, I couldn't do what he did as a rhythm player. As a lead player, he had his thing that he did, and it was amazing and singular. And you hit it on the head. That piece at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame showcased it for all time. Now, here's the other thing that happened there. At the point where I left the band, he stepped back into that role. And then he did.
Wendy wasn't the player you were either, though.
Wendy was a rhythm player. And that was why he felt he had to step back into that role. And then subsequently, kind of after that version of the band, he kind of never really gave that role back up. And there were some great guys. I mean, there's some great players that, kind of stood in that spot, subsequently. But for that song, for that record, he just, he rolled tape and I played. He didn't have anything to say about do something like this, do something like that. We did like 5 passes. And when he felt, this is where he did, exercise sort of the producer's, right. When he felt we had enough, then we went back to those passes and comped together a solo. And he took the lead in that process. And I was fine with that because it's like, I kind of said what I had to say 5 different ways. So, you tell me what you think fits, what you think works best. So we comped it. And after it was comped, it was great that I did the playing and he did the comping, because he put together pieces I wouldn't necessarily have put together. In fact, I had to go back and I had to relearn the solo, because there were phrases that I would not play back to back. There were transitions. There's no way I would go from playing this to playing that. But the way he ended up editing, that's what we got.
And I do think I was going to say I think Wendy was a great player in her own right, but there's
Yeah.
definitely a transition in what Prince was covering and you were covering to when she joined the band. The dynamic changed and he took over more of those leads.
Yeah.
I have to ask you this. Speaking of the this is a little bit of a going off on a fanboy question, but I'm going to do it. Talking about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame thing, Prince had claimed that and this is in, Rolling Stone or whatever, he had never heard While My Guitar Gently Weeps before he was going to do that, had him send him a copy. Now, knowing Prince, knowing the Around the World in the Day album and all that, I find it hard to believe that Prince didn't know the Beatles music. And I'm just curious, was he not versed in the Beatles? Because I kind of find that really hard to believe.
We used to jam Beatles songs in rehearsal. Okay. So
yeah.
He
so that
did.
Was press.
He was a master of the art of pulling people's leg. And that was something that was a valued art within the band, pranking. And let me tell you, this encapsulates it. One time we were in LA and we're staying at this hotel called La Bolage, I think it was. One of those. There were same company owned a couple of different hotels. So we step out of our rooms to go do like a press thing, and we look down the hall, and Billy Joel, like, I don't know, 8 doors down or whatever, he's stepping out of his room. So we get in the hallway, and Billy sees Prince and whatever. So he's like, oh, and want to do the thing that folks always did, and come up and say, hey, great to meet you. Billy says, man, I love your stuff. Prince just looked back at him, just looked him dead in the face, and just refused to say anything. I mean, other than going on to some other pleasantries, but what he didn't do was say, oh man, I love your stuff too. Because he would just kind of, he would just kind of mind game you like that sometimes. Just so we could talk about it later. I don't know. But that was a particularly funny one. The other one that he used to do, he was right-handed. But when he met somebody for the first time, he would put out his left hand. So you had to shake left-handed. Not because he was left-handed, but so he made you do something. That's what it was.
That's hilarious. Well, I think we've got time for one more question. And I just wondered, Des, is there a particular memory from your career and time as a professional musician that stands out to you as something you cherish that you could share with us?
It's funny. Probably the one moment that was most precious to me, it isn't like necessarily the mountaintop stuff. And there's a lot of that. And I say all the time, man, I'm Forrest Gump. Somehow I just kind of stumbled up into all this stuff, and looking back, it feels like a Where's Waldo book. But the greatest moment, about 4 years ago, the folks at South by Southwest, I had a great relationship with them over the years, asked me to put together, curate a tribute to Prince. And I put together, it was great. It put together, it was just one of those things that just kind of fell together. It wasn't great because it had anything to do with me, but Wyclef Jean and Andre Simone. And I took some folks from Nashville who, from a band called Guilty Pleasures that I do shows with, just because I know them and I know that they'll nail it and get things quickly. And so we had a bunch of folks that I got from in town here, some folks from Guilty Pleasures, Steve Eby. Some of those folks got Joseph Wooten, friend of mine, great keyboard player, also plays with Steve Miller. Mickey Free, my friend Mickey Free, from the infamous Dave Chappelle. Mickey Free is a dude. That whole thing. But we did this show, and it was amazing. I mean, there were like 25,000 people there. It was amazing. But my favorite moment of all time, I had my oldest son and his band Bitter Pills open for us. So there's a moment where I'm standing side stage with my youngest son, who's obviously his much younger brother, and I'm holding his hand, and we're watching older brother sound check. And one of the folks, Trisha from Guilty Pleasures, who I brought along to do the show, took a picture of us from behind and captured me standing there with Cannon, holding his hand, watching Jordan. My favorite moment of all time, bar none. Yeah, sat with famous people, did amazing things. All that was priceless, but nothing compared to that.
And your son's band is Bitter Pills?
Bitter Pills, yeah.
Awesome. Good to know. Des, thank you so much for taking the time to visit with us and share stories. And again, at Middle Tennessee State, we're thrilled that you're going to be giving back to students this fall. And I believe we'll stop the recording now and meet up probably about 3:30 tomorrow, and that'll be us doing a little Q&A with the folks at the conference.